They say an Omega's spine is built for bowing. But history forgot the sheer, terrifying strength of a woman with nothing left to lose. What happens when the weakest pack member drags a dying beast through a blizzard? This is the true story of blood, snow, and a stolen crown. According to the fragmented historical ledgers of the High Council, the winter of 1492 was brutally recorded as the White Death. Across the jagged peaks of the Northern Territories, temperatures plummeted to a life-threatening 30 degrees below zero. In the desolate outskirts of the Oakhaven Pack territory, survival was not a right. It was a daily, agonizing chore. This was especially true for Genevieve. Genevieve was an Omega in the rigid, unforgiving hierarchy of medieval Lycan society. Being born an Omega was akin to a curse. It meant a life of servitude, cast out to the drafty, rotting cabins on the very edge of the territory line. Her father, a lowly apothecary named Jacob Miller, had passed away 3 winters prior, leaving her with nothing but his leather-bound journals and a meager knowledge of herbs. She was small, her wolf small and pale, possessing none of the physical prowess or intimidating aura of the alphas and betas who ruled Oakhaven. On the evening of December 14th, the sky turned the color of a bruised plum, signaling the arrival of a massive storm. Genevieve was out checking her rabbit snares near the tree line of the Whispering Pines, desperate for any scraps of meat to survive the incoming freeze. The wind was already howling, whipping snow into her eyes like shards of glass. That was when the wind shifted, and she caught it. It wasn't the scent of game, it was the sharp, metallic tang of copper, thick and fresh. Beneath the blood was something far more alarming, the acrid, burning odor of Aconitum napellus wolfsbane mixed with the unmistakable, suffocating scent of burning silver ash. It was an assassin's concoction, a poison specifically engineered to bypass a Lycan's rapid healing factor and melt them from the inside out. Against every survival instinct screaming at her to return to her cabin, Genevieve followed the scent. She waded through snowdrifts that reached her thighs, guided by the gruesome trail of dark crimson staining the pristine white snow. At the base of a massive ancient oak tree, she found him. Genevieve's breath hitched, her lungs seizing in the freezing air. Lying half buried in the snow was a wolf the size of a draft horse. His fur was as black as the midnight sky, tipped with frost and silver. This was no ordinary pack member. His sheer size, the primal energy radiating from him even as he lay dying, marked him as a Lycan of royal blood. He was violently trembling, his massive chest heaving as a deep, jagged gash along his flank poured blackened, poisoned blood into the snow. As Genevieve cautiously approached, the immense beast shuddered. The poison was actively destroying his internal magic, forcing his body to regress to its human form to conserve energy. Bones cracked and reshaped in a sickening symphony of anatomical shifts until a man lay in the snow. He was colossal, heavily muscled and covered in combat scars. His aristocratic face was pale and slick with a deathly sweat, dark hair plastered to his forehead. But it was the intricate, scarred brand over his heart that made Genevieve's blood run cold, a rampant wolf intertwined with a crown of thorns. She was looking at Gideon, the Lycan King of the Northern Reaches. The political rumors from the capital had trickled down even to the Omega. There were whispers of a coup, of Gideon's ruthless half-brother Cedric plotting to seize the throne. Knocking at the silver-laced wound, the truth was laid bare. Cedric had struck. Leave. A voice rasped, barely a whisper over the howling wind. Gideon's eyes fluttered open. They were a piercing, striking gold, though currently clouded with pain and impending death. They are coming. Genevieve knew the laws. An Omega was forbidden to touch a royal. Furthermore, if Cedric's assassins found her with the king, she would be flayed alive. Logic dictated she walk away. But as she looked into the dying king's eyes, an inexplicable magnetic pull anchored her to the spot. A deep, ancient hum vibrated in her chest, a sensation she had never felt before. "I cannot let him die," her inner wolf whimpered, pacing frantically in her mind. "I am not leaving you," Genevieve said, her voice shaking but resolute. She had to get him to the abandoned monastery at the peak of Widow's Ridge. There an old exiled monk named Brother Thomas kept a sanctuary. He had the antidotes, but Widow's Ridge was 6 miles away, uphill, through a blizzard. Genevieve stripped off her thick, woolen outer cloak. She gathered sturdy fallen pine branches, using her freezing numb fingers to lash them together with the heavy leather ties from her boots and traps, creating a makeshift travois. It was crude, but it had to work. With a scream of exertion, Genevieve rolled the unconscious 240-pound king onto her cloak, securing him to the pine branches. She took the front ropes, wrapping them heavily around her own frail shoulders. The wood dug into her collarbones, threatening to dislocate her joints. She looked up at the darkening sky as the blizzard fully descended, swallowing the forest in an impenetrable wall of white. Genevieve gritted her teeth, leaned forward, and took the first step. The anatomical impossibility of an undernourished omega pulling a dead weight twice her size through a hostile environment should have dictated a swift end to their journey. Modern survivalists studying the terrain of the northern reaches agree that navigating Widow's Ridge in a blizzard is a death sentence, even for fully equipped mountaineers. For Genevieve, the first mile was pure, unadulterated agony. The snow was relentless, piling up so rapidly that every step required her to lift her legs waist-high, breaking the powder before dragging Gideon's heavy sled forward. The crude leather straps bit through her thin undershirt, rubbing her shoulders raw until blood began to seep through the fabric, freezing instantly in the wind. One step. Just one more step, she chanted in her mind, a desperate rhythmic mantra. By the 3rd mile, the temperature had dropped so severely that Genevieve lost all feeling in her toes and fingers. Frostbite was setting in. Her breath plumed in the air like thick smoke, her lungs burning as if she were inhaling shattered glass. She hallucinated briefly, seeing the warm hearth of her childhood home, smelling her father's stew. The vision almost made her drop to her knees and surrender to the soft, warm embrace of the snow. A sudden violent cough from the sled snapped her back to reality. Genevieve stopped and fell to her knees beside Gideon. His lips were turning a dangerous shade of blue, the black veins of the wolfsbane creeping up his neck like spiderwebs. He was shivering violently. "Stay with me," Genevieve pleaded, pulling her frozen, bare hands out of her mittens to press them against his icy cheeks. "You cannot die out here. Do you hear me?" Gideon's golden eyes cracked open. The raw vulnerability in his gaze stripped away the terrifying aura of the Lycan King. In this frozen hell, he was just a dying man. "Why?" He breathed out, his voice a broken rumble. "Why do you sacrifice yourself for a stranger?" "Because nobody deserves to die alone in the dark," she whispered fiercely. Suddenly a sound echoed from the valley below, cutting through the howl of the wind. Genevieve froze. It wasn't the natural call of a wild wolf. It was a hunting cadence, coordinated, ruthless. Cedric's enforcers, led by his most vicious tracker, Garrick, had found the blood trail. They were coming for the king's head. Panic, cold and sharp, flooded Genevieve's veins. Adrenaline masked her exhaustion. She remembered a trick her father had taught her about the properties of the local flora. She frantically dug through the snow, unearthing handfuls of pungent, crushed pine needles and wild mint. She rubbed them furiously over Gideon's wounds and the bottom of the makeshift sled, desperately trying to mask the scent of the poisoned blood. She grabbed the ropes again. The fear of the hunting pack drove her forward. Mile 4 and 5 blurred into a nightmare of physical deterioration. Genevieve's boots were soaked through, her muscles screaming in lactic acid overload. She was no longer walking. She was throwing her weight forward and letting gravity pull the sled an inch at a time. As they reached the treacherous incline of Widow's Ridge, the storm reached its zenith. The wind shrieked like a dying banshee. Genevieve slipped on a patch of black ice hidden beneath the snow, falling hard onto her knees. The sled slid backward, threatening to pull them both over the edge of the steep ravine. Genevieve screamed, digging her bleeding fingernails into the frozen earth, anchoring herself. Her shoulder popped a partial dislocation, but she refused to let go of the ropes. "No!" she roared, a primal sound tearing from her throat. Her inner wolf, small but possessing an unbreakable will, surged forward, lending her a burst of supernatural strength. She hauled the sled up, over the precipice, and collapsed onto the flat plateau. There, illuminated by the faint, eerie glow of the moon breaking through the storm clouds, stood the heavy oak doors of the sanctuary abbey. Using the last dregs of her strength, Genevieve dragged Gideon to the entrance and pounded her bloody fists against the wood. "Brother Thomas, help us!" The heavy doors groaned open. The elderly monk, holding a flickering lantern, stared in absolute shock at the half-dead Omega and the poisoned king at her feet. "By the goddess," Thomas whispered, rushing forward to help drag Gideon inside the worn stone walls. They hauled the king onto a sturdy wooden table near the roaring hearth. Thomas immediately went to work, gathering his vials of charcoal, crushed moonflower, and pure, untainted werewolf blood to counteract the silver. Genevieve slumped against the stone wall, her body trembling uncontrollably as the warmth of the room hit her freezing skin, causing a wave of excruciating pain. Hours passed in the tense, bloody blur. Thomas forced the antidote down Gideon's throat, binding his wounds with poultices. Genevieve refused to sleep, sitting by the table, watching the king's chest slowly stabilize. The black veins on his neck began to recede. Just before dawn, the roaring fire popped loudly. Gideon's golden eyes snapped open, fully clear and blazing with returned power. He sat up, his massive chest heaving as he scanned the room. His gaze locked onto Genevieve, huddled in the corner, bruised, bleeding, and trembling. The air in the room suddenly grew heavy. The scent of pine, snow, and old parchments Genevieve scent hit Gideon's senses like a physical blow. The ancient magic of the Lycans, the infallible cosmic law that governed their souls, snapped into place with a definitive, ringing clarity. Gideon's breath caught. He stared at the lowly Omega who had hauled him out of the jaws of death, his voice filled with absolute awe and possessive reverence. Must, before Genevieve could process the impossible weight of that word, the heavy wooden doors of the abbey shuddered violently under the force of a battering ram. Garrick and Cedric's men had arrived. The heavy iron-reinforced oak doors of Widow's Ridge Abbey splintered inward with a deafening crack. Wood fragments the size of daggers rained across the stone floor. Through the swirling vortex of the blizzard, tearing into the room, stepped Garrick. Historical accounts from the annals of the Silver Cord describe Garrick not merely as a tracker, but as a butcher. He stood 6'7", his face a map of jagged, poorly healed scars, wielding a broadsword etched with toxic silver runes. Behind him piled half a dozen of Cedric's elite enforcers, their eyes glowing with the sickly yellow hue of bloodlust. "Brother Thomas," Garrick purred, his voice a gravelly sneer that echoed over the howling wind. "Harboring fugitives is a violation of the Eithilgard Treaty. Produce the king's corpse, and we might let you keep your tongue." Genevieve shrank back against the hearth, her dislocated shoulder screaming in agony. The word Gideon had just spoken, mate, was still ringing in her ears, a cosmic impossibility. Omegas did not mate with royals. It was a genetic anomaly, an event undocumented in centuries of Lycan history. Yet the invisible tether pulling at her soul, vibrating with an ancient protective fury, was undeniable. Gideon swung his legs over the edge of the wooden table. He was still pale, his body covered in sweat and the dark, bruised residue of the neutralized wolfsbane. He wore only his shredded trousers, his massive chest bearing the gruesome, freshly closed scar of the assassin's blade. He did not look like a king in his prime. He looked like a cornered god clinging to the mortal realm. But when his golden eyes locked onto Garrick, the temperature in the room seemed to drop another 10 degrees. "Garrick," Gideon rumbled, his voice low, vibrating with a lethal, terrifying authority. "I see my bastard brother finally let you off your leash." "Nah." Garrick's confident smirk faltered for a fraction of a second, shocked to see the king sitting upright. The wolfsbane should have liquefied his organs hours ago. Then the tracker's eyes darted to the corner, landing on the shivering, blood-soaked form of Genevieve. He inhaled sharply, catching the scent of the Omega mixed with the overwhelming possessive pheromones of the Alpha King. "An Omega?" Garrick barked a cruel, incredulous laugh. "The great Lycan King is tethered to the lowest filth of the pack. Cedric will weep with laughter when I bring him both your heads." Garrick lunged. Despite his weakened state, Gideon moved with a terrifying liquid grace. He didn't shift into his wolf form. The poison had depleted too much of his magical reserves for a full transformation. But his claws extended from his fingertips, thick and black as obsidian. He intercepted Garrick's silver broadsword with his bare forearm, the metal hissing and burning his skin, that he didn't even flinch. With a roar that shook the soot from the abbey's chimney, Gideon struck, driving his claws into the shoulder of the nearest enforcer and using the man as a human shield against Garrick's next swing. Chaos erupted. The abbey transformed into a slaughterhouse. Brother Thomas stacked behind the altar as the enforcers swarmed the king. Gideon fought with a savage, desperate brilliance, snapping limbs and crushing windpipes. But he was outnumbered and running on the fumes of the antidote. Every strike he took from a silver-laced weapon slowed him down, his golden eyes flickering. Genevieve watched a second enforcer creep up behind Gideon, raising a silver dagger aimed directly at the base of the king's spine. The subservience bred into her bones screamed at her to hide, but the newly awakened lunar bond roared louder. Genevieve scrambled toward Brother Thomas's overturned apothecary cart. Her father, Jacob Miller, had taught her the volatile properties of raw earth elements. She grabbed a fistful of crushed sulfur and a glass vial of refined moon salt. As the assassin drove his blade downward, Genevieve threw herself forward, hurling the mixture directly into the roaring fireplace. Boom! A blinding, concussive flash of white light and a thick cloud of acrid, blinding smoke instantly filled the stone room. The enforcers shrieked, dropping their weapons to claw at their burning eyes. The distraction was all Gideon needed. Pivoting on his heel, he caught the blinded assassin by the throat and snapped his neck with a sickening crunch. He then vaulted over the wooden table, tackling Garrick to the stone floor. The tracker slashed wildly, opening a fresh, bloody gash across Gideon's ribs, but the king felt no pain, only the primal need to protect his mate. Gideon's jaws extended, his fangs elongating as he tore Garrick's throat out in one swift, brutal motion. The remaining 3 assassins, seeing their leader dead and their eyes streaming from the sulfur smoke, scrambled out the splintered doors, disappearing into the white abyss of the blizzard. Silence descended on the abbey, save for the crackling of the fire and the ragged, heavy breathing of the king. Gideon stood slowly, covered in blood that was not his own. He turned to Genevieve. She was on her knees, clutching her dislocated shoulder, terrified he would scold her for intervening in an alpha's fight. Instead, the massive Lycan King crossed the room, dropping to his knees before her. His golden eyes were soft, filled with absolute reverence. He gently reached out, his massive, blood-stained hands cradling her face as if she were made of spun glass. "You saved my life in the snow," Gideon whispered, pressing his forehead against hers. "And you fought for me in the fire. You are no Omega, Genevieve. You are my queen. And it is time we reclaim our home." The journey back to Aethelgard, the capital stronghold of the northern reaches, took 3 days. The blizzard had broken, leaving behind a frozen, silent world of glittering ice. With every mile they walked, the bond between Gideon and Genevieve solidified. repairing the king's magical core at an exponential rate. Genevieve's own demeanor began to shift. The hunched, fearful posture of the Omega vanished, replaced by an innate, regal stillness that commanded the respect of the winter forest itself. The twist in the historical ledger, the true betrayal, was not merely Cedric's ambition. According to the recovered Winter Solstice Edict of 1492, Cedric was merely a pawn. The true mastermind was Dowager Duchess Beatrice, their stepmother, who had manipulated the High Council's Chancellor Reginald into funding the assassination. They despised Gideon's progressive rulings, particularly his desire to abolish the brutal caste system that kept Omegas in squalor. On the morning of the winter solstice, the great hall of Eithilgard was packed with the region's elite alphas and betas. Banners of crimson and gold hung from the rafter. Cedric stood upon the obsidian dais, draped in the king's ceremonial furs. Beside him stood the Dowager Duchess Beatrice, her face a mask of smug victory, and Chancellor Reginald holding the crown of thorns. "My brother," Cedric addressed the hushed crowd, his voice dripping with faux sorrow, "fell to rogue elements in the Whispering Pines. We mourn the king, but the pack must survive. As the bloodline dictates, I claim the mantle of Alpha Supreme." The crowd murmured, some cheering, others hesitant. Reginald stepped forward to place the crown upon Cedric's head. Crash! The massive iron-wrought doors of the great hall were violently blown off their hinges, flying 20 feet into the air before slamming into the stone floor. The sheer force of the entrance silenced the entire room. Through the dust and settling snow stepped King Gideon. He was fully healed, radiating an aura of dominance so suffocating that several betas in the front row immediately dropped to their knees, baring their throats in submission. But the true shock rippled through the crowd as they looked at the woman holding his hand. Genevieve wore a simple, tailored gown provided by Brother Thomas's allies, but she carried herself with a terrifying, serene grace. The pack felt the shift in the atmospheric pressure. The magic of the Luna, a power dormant for generations, was vibrating off her in waves. "I hear," Gideon's voice boomed, echoing off the vaulted ceilings like thunder, "that reports of my death would greatly exaggerate it." Cedric stumbled backward, his face draining of all color. Dowager Beatrice let out a strangled gasp, clutching her throat. "Guards!" Cedric shrieked, his voice cracking. "It's a trick, a shapeshifter. Kill them." No one moved. The king's aura had paralyzed the room. "You bring an army of cowards to steal my throne, Cedric," Gideon sneered, stalking down the center aisle, pulling Genevieve with him. "And you conspired with the mother who fed me wolfsbane under the guise of peace." He locked eyes with Beatrice, who immediately shrank behind the throne. "She is an Omega," Chancellor Reginald suddenly shouted, pointing a trembling, accusatory finger at Genevieve, desperate to retain control. "Even if you are the true king, you pollute the royal bloodline. The laws of Eithilgard forbid an Omega to sit upon the dais. She is weak. She is nothing." "Ma!" The great hall erupted into tense murmurs. The old prejudices ran deep. Genevieve let go of Gideon's hand. She did not look at the king for permission. She stepped forward, alone, facing the High Council and the usurpers. The Omega, who had dragged a dying beast 6 miles through a blizzard, looked at the soft, pampered nobles of the court with absolute pity. "I am Genevieve Miller," she spoke, her voice not loud, but possessing a strange dual resonance, as if the ancient ancestors of the pack were speaking alongside her. "And you speak of weakness, Chancellor." Without warning, Genevieve stepped up to the nearest ceremonial brazier, which burned with a high-temperature, silver-infused flameifier designed to test the purity of alphas. Before anyone could stop her, she plunged her bare hand directly into the silver fire. The crowd gasped in horror. Silver fire should have incinerated an Omega's flesh instantly. Genevieve stood perfectly still. The flames licked up her forearm, but her skin did not burn. Instead, the fire turned a brilliant, blinding gold. The absolute purity of her will, combined with the unbreakable true mate bond to the Alpha King, granted her immunity. She was no longer just an Omega. The cosmic scales had balanced. She was the physical embodiment of the pack's survival. She pulled her unblemished hand from the fire and looked directly at Cedric. "I carried your king through the White Death. I bled into the snow so he could breathe. Tell me, Cedric, what have you bled for?" "Not." Cedric, humiliated and cornered, let out a feral roar. He shifted mid-leap, turning into a massive rust-colored wolf, lunging straight for Genevieve. He never made it. Gideon intercepted him mid-air. The king did not bother shifting. With a brutal, earth-shattering display of physical supremacy, Gideon grabbed the rusted wolf by the jaws, using his momentum to slam him into the obsidian dais. The stone cracked. With a sickening wrench, Gideon broke Cedric's neck. The usurper fell lifeless at the foot of the throne. The hall descended into absolute terrified silence. Gideon wiped his hands on his trousers, his chest heaving, his golden eyes sweeping over the crowd, daring anyone else to challenge him. He turned to Dowager Beatrice and Chancellor Reginald. "Throw them in the iron cells," Gideon ordered the royal guards, who immediately snapped into action, dragging the screaming conspirators away. Gideon turned back to Genevieve. The terrifying Alpha King melted away, leaving only the devoted mate. He ascended the shattered dais, picked up the crown of thorns and turned to the crowd. But he did not place it on his own head. He knelt before the Omega. "To the woman whose spine never broke," Gideon declared, his voice ringing with absolute finality. He placed the heavy ancient crown upon Genevieve's head. "My mate, my equal, your Luna." As the crown settled upon her brow, a profound golden shockwave of magic pulsed through the great hall. Every single Lycan in the room, Alphas, Betas, and the Omegas hiding in the galleys, fell to their knees in synchronized reverence. The White Death had failed to claim them, and from the ashes of a poisoned winter, the most powerful reign in Lycan history had begun. Did the tale of Genevieve's miraculous survival and stunning rise to power leave you breathless? Don't let the story end here. Hit that like button to honor the true strength of the Luna. Share this epic medieval romance with your pack of friends, and make sure to subscribe to our channel for more thrilling, true-to-life fantasy sagas. Your support helps us bring more legends to life.